and so on and so forth. Family relationships. But for the purpose of today's talk, I'm going to be focusing mostly on, well, actually not mostly, all on romantic relationships. When we get to the end, what I'll do is I'll have time for Q&A. And in the Q&A section, you can ask me anything that you have about today's talk. If there's something you want me to explain a little bit more, if there's something that came up, then we can answer those questions then. If there's something that you have as a question that's not related to today's talk, and we have time and I can answer it then, I'll be happy to do so. What I encourage each and every one of you to do is take notes. Take notes because there will be things that will come up and that you may want to ask a question later on, or there might be something that you want to remember, something you want to ask me about at the end, something you want to reference back to. And if you're watching this and you're one half of a romantic partnership, you might take something away from here that you want to go and share with your partners, which that leads me to my last point before we get started. Everything I say is worthless unless you put it into action. So the last thing I want is for you to walk away from this and say, oh, that was great, Jesse had some good content, and then you do nothing with it. My hope is that you will use what we talk about today, use what I share, and use it to really hopefully improve your relationships. Perhaps for some of you might transform them. Some of what I'll share with you today is some of the same ideas, concept, tools, techniques, strategies that I've taught to clients all over the world, both as in relationships and working with the couples, and in individuals in the relationships trying to work through them together. So we have some really good stuff today. All right, I think that was the bulk of the updates. So let's get started, shall we? 3 keys to making your relationship last. Oh, and if I don't answer your question during it, that doesn't mean I don't want to answer the question. It just means I'm going to try to keep the train of thought going and answer questions at the end. So please hold your questions to the end. As always, you can do little hearts and smiley faces and stuff. And this is also interactive. I may ask you questions at times, or you can give me a thumbs up, or you can just comment in, and please do so. I like to know that you are still awake and listening. Okay? So 3 keys to making your relationships last. Relationships are really interesting. I think it's one of the probably more fascinating dichotomies we have in humanity. Because most people, when they're really honest, will say they want a romantic relationship, right? We all want to be loved. We all want to be loved, and not only do we all want to be loved, but I would say the most of us, pretty much everybody I've met, wants to be loved in a certain way by a specific special person, right? Now, we might romanticize this, and sometimes we call it soulmate, sometimes we call it our star-class lover, we call it fate, we call it all sorts of things, and most of us want that, right? So much so that you think about a huge part of the entertainment business is driven by that, knowing that so many of us want that. Right? How many of you have sat through God knows how many romantic comedies, rom-coms, even though you know the format's exactly the same and you can expect what to do, but you still watch it because of the feelings it brings up. Show of hands, right? Or how many of you have listened to, how many, love songs are there out there, right? Makeup, breakups, and all those things. I would argue that love is probably one of the most focused on in ways of relating in the entertainment industry. I cannot tell you how many. I've seen a lot of romantic comedies in my life. I'm quite proud to say that. And the formula is pretty predictable, right? It's you have a boy meets girl scenario, but they're opposites, right? They're never anything quite similar. So they come together from some sort of extraordinary circumstances, and then inevitably, what happens? There's some sort of it's wackiness ensues. They get together. They unlikely relationship, and suddenly they're in love, and they get a dog. But then there's conflict, right? Something happens. Maybe it's the crazy aunt doesn't improve, or one of them makes a mistake and drinks too much and says something or acts a certain way, and now they're apart. And then you cue the slow motion sad music playing, where they're walking around looking like they just got their puppy run over by a car. They look depressed. They look upset. They have all the sad music playing in the background. Time goes on. They have the what is that called in movies, where you have basically the fades to show that time's passing. And eventually, when the end of the sad song finishes, that's to let give you a cue that enough time's passed, and now they're ready to start maybe branching off or looking at another part of life, and so perhaps they start dating, and of course at that point they go on some blind dates or whatnot that their friends who are equally as wacky set them up on. And while they go out on these blind dates, they never quite amass to the level of what the one was, right? The one that got away. And so, and at some point, one of the friends, who's probably the more wise friend of them, the wingman or wingwoman, starts to lean on him and say something like, "Why don't you just call him? Why don't you reach out to her? Send her an email." And then, of course, the person says, "Well, I can't, blah, 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 blah." But eventually, of course, they do, and then they come back together, and 9 times out of 10, they live happily ever after, right? Anybody seen a movie like that more than once? I know I've seen more of them like that than I can count. That's kind of where the business of, that's the business of love right there, right, in a nutshell. And what doesn't happen, though, in our relationships is our relationships don't necessarily play out like a romantic comedy. I think one of the biggest struggles so many people have in a relationship is they go into a relationship thinking that there's going to be the Disneyization of a relationship. I see quite a few of you doing hearts and thumbs up in here, so I'm assuming that means that you get what I'm saying. The Disneyization of a relationship means that, again, boy meets girl, they come together, conflict ensues, but eventually they end up happily ever after, right? You notice all Disney movies, when they'd follow that scenario, it ends with them getting ready to kiss, it fades, the birds are chirping, all those types of things, and then it says they live happily ever after. Well, for those of us who are raised on those kinds of movies, it creates an unrealistic expectation, because what happens after that first kiss? And the magic starts to fade, so to speak, and the real challenges come in. Right, that's when we start to really get to know a person, and we have disagreements. Somebody wants the toilet seat lit up, another wants it down. Somebody thinks the trash should be taken out when it's this far away from the top, and the other one thinks it doesn't get taken out until it's overflowing like this. Right, that's where the relationship longevity really begins to get tested. It's not when you're trying to overcome some sort of obstacle or get away from the fire-breathing dragon. While that could be a challenge in a relationship, it's the little things. I often wonder why Disney hasn't made a movie yet where it goes inside the house, Cinderella or Snow White 10 years later, and you get to see how they're actually getting on in the relationship from that point. This is where I think it ties into so many of our relationships, because as we start to fall into the routine of a relationship, it becomes just that, it becomes routine. Right? We don't have dragons, fire-breathing dragons popping into our lives. We don't have damsels getting in distresses or knights in shining armors all the time riding through. But what we do have is we have work, we have mortgages, we have jobs we go to, we have kids, we have soccer games that we have to take our kids to, we have family obligations, we have PTA functions, we have networking events, we have all those life things that don't get covered in Disney or romantic comedy movies. And what happens with that is it can become routine. It becomes routine, right? It becomes routine seeing your spouse there when you get home. It becomes routine seeing where their toothbrush is going. It becomes routine seeing them leave their underwear on the floor. And if you're someone who doesn't like that, what happens is those routines can start to build up until eventually what happens, ladies and gentlemen, there's the explosion, right? And that leads into fight, conflict, so on and so forth. And that even can become a routine in itself, right? Show of hands, thumbs up, hearts, you've been there before. So much of routine happens because inevitably there's not enough new. So relationships can take on this course where the greatest part of the relationship is one where the fight happens, because immediately after is where that's where the getting along happens, or the makeup happens, and because there's this energy shift, or the vacation or something like that. But for the other 350 some days out of the year, the relationship can, I don't want to say struggle, but it can seem routine. There's nothing new, there's nothing exciting in it, which leads to my first tip, key number one, is you got to keep things new. You got to keep things new. Now, what do I mean by that? Well, when we get into a routine, right? Routine is routine because there's nothing new in it, right? There takes a lot of variables. We don't remember the commute to our drive to work, except for the one time that we see an accident, or except for the one time that there's a police car chasing down somebody else. except for the one time that there's something so new and dramatically different that it stands out, and then it creates an imprint on our mind of something new. Most of the time we don't have that in relationships, right? We don't have that newness because we've gotten into routine, and the routine is just about flow. It's about keeping things operational, status quo. We have to bring some newness into it, right? We have to bring some newness into it. So what does that mean? Well, it can mean making it a goal to go to a new restaurant every week or once a month. It can mean a goal of doing every Tuesday, you're going to try a new activity. You're going to play a new board game. You're going to watch a new type of movie, a new channel, a new station. You're going to read a new kind of book. Whatever that is, that's something that's bringing into the relationship that you don't already have there. That's something that's going against the grain or the norm of the routine. That's what I mean by new. Because in that, what it does is it allows you to I want to say sensorily, but I don't think that's a word. It allows you to sensory bring in new information and experience a new kind of reality, right? We're seeing something different. There's different smells, different feelings, different emotions, all those types of things. Right? Think about the experience of going to a restaurant for the first time, and it might be a type of food that you've never had before. How much more aware your taste buds are of that. Right? And you may not like the food necessarily, but the experience you'll always remember. You think about the first time you go to a concert of music you don't really care for, or maybe you absolutely love. And the experience of it you'll always remember because it's so new, it's so different. Relationships die on stagnation and they thrive on newness. Right? You think about what brought the two of you together in the first place was the newness of it all. Right? The way they looked at you was a different way than anybody else had ever looked at you. The way they spoke to you, the way they treated you was a different way than you'd ever been spoken to or treated before. You went through certain life situations that you hadn't gone through before. That maybe perhaps there was something traumatic or life-altering that happened in your courtship that brought you two together. Right? All those things, most of what brings a relationship together is the newness. And so relationships thrive on that newness because it's exciting. We like to have that stimulation. We need that stimulation. But then we bring in stagnation after time. So key number one to making your relationship last is you got to bring newness in. You have to make newness a top priority in the relationship, and doing something every day, if not every day, every week at the minimum, to do something new in there. Number two key to making your relationship last is asking questions. Asking questions. Well, what do I mean by that? Well, tragically, most of us get in relationships and we start to assume our way through relationships. Right? We start to assume our way through the relationships. We assume we know what our partner wants. We assume we know what time they're going to do this. We assume we know what they're going to order. We assume they know what time they're going to get up. We assume that what kind of shows they're going to watch, what kind of movies they're going to watch, where they want to go, all those things. What their political belief is, what their religious belief is, what their spiritual belief is. We assume. We don't ask enough questions. This came up in a conversation the other day where I was talking with a friend, and we were joking around about the cruise ships, and you see those game show type things on cruise ships where they have the couples come up and what is it? I don't know if they play the newlywed game or whatever it is, and they have to ask questions about the other person, right? And you find that quite a few of them don't know the answers to these other questions. Now, why is that? This is supposed to be their best friend, their closest person, right? The one who knows them better than everybody else, but yet they get 4 out of 10 right. I don't know, 40%, that's not that great. We could have guessed probably better than that. And it's because most of us don't ask questions. We assume our way through the relationship. We don't ask questions. So here's what I mean. Here's where you need the big idea here is to start asking questions. Even if you think you know, ask. Even if you think you know, ask. And if you get an answer that is a yes, no, ask in a different way. Why is that? Because asking allows you to, again, bring in newness. It allows you to stimulate a different part of your brain, and it allows you to look at the relationship from a different perspective. The perspective that's not in the routine of it all. It's not in the assumption. Easy example, right? Politics are going on right now in the United States, and it is a heated battle, a circus of an experience. Now, what oftentimes, and I've had a conversation with a couple of my clients who are in relationships about this, is there will be an assumption about what the other's political belief is. And if there's a disagreement with it, it just immediately grows in this fight. Who's right, who's wrong? The more proactive approach for a long-term and fulfilling relationship would be to ask why they believe that. And when you ask these questions, what's really important is if you're the asker, you have to be willing to listen without judgment. Even if they're saying something that you don't necessarily like or you don't necessarily believe in, when you ask, that's your time to zip the lips and open up these and really listen and use these. Use these more than you ever had before. A lot of times in relationships, there's almost this fear of asking questions or hesitancy to, and we default to assumptions so much because we haven't developed these muscles very well. And so we say we say something like we want to know, but really what we want to do is we want to be right or we want the other person to be wrong. That is not going to lead to a successful question asking session. What leads to a successful question asking session is what's going to allow your partner to know it's safe and allow for a dialogue to develop is to listen. Ask and listen. Ask and listen. If you're getting a lot of yes no answers in your relationships, my bet is it's because you are not doing a good job listening. And so the partner, your husband, your wife, your spouse, your significant other, whoever this is, boyfriend, girlfriend, has learned to respond with yes no's because what that means is then they get themselves off the hook of having to face the, I'm going to use a dramatic word, the wrath of the disagreement. Right? We can have conversations and not agree, but they can be conversations. They don't have to be arguments or fights. I will have conversations often with friends, with people who I care about in my life, and we may not agree at all politically about things. And that's okay. I love listening to what they say, especially if they don't agree with me, because it's a fascinating experience hearing why they believe that way. I love that. And I encourage you all to fall in love with listening. Fall in love with listening. Because in that, and this is going to be a bonus one, so we'll say 4 tips, and this will be a bonus one. Fall in love with listening. Listening will be one of the greatest gifts that you can give to anybody, especially if it's somebody you love. Because in a world where we have so many ways of communicating and so many of us feel unheard, opening up your ears and allowing yourself to listen from a loving place, a place that's not bogged down by judgment or burdened by guilt, is going to give the most comfortable and safe platform for your relationship to grow and prosper on. A relationship cannot be fulfilling without asking questions, and it cannot be fulfilling without listening. Because inevitably in that dynamic, somebody's needs are not going to get met. It's just, that's what's going to happen. And any of you who have been there before, show of hands, show of hearts, know that if you feel like you're not being heard in the relationship, it's often one of the most lonely and unhappy places to be in, right? Because you have this person who's supposedly your best friend, your partner, your lover, and they don't even know who you are. You have something to say, you have a voice, you want to share it, but they don't seem to have a care in the world, nor a desire to listen to it. Right? Is this connecting with some of you? And what ends up happening in that dynamic is distance. Right? We create distance, we start to fall apart, and then we just fall back on assumptions. And then what happens is we assume enough times until eventually there's this eruption. Finally, somebody can't take it anymore, and then we start to go to the arguments, we yell, we scream, and then we think afterwards one of 2 things. Wow, I feel better. Why don't I feel better like this all the time? Unfortunately, we start to learn a negative association of how to feel better, which is going to be arguing and yelling and screaming. We don't want to do that. And number 2, we may walk away with the feeling that this person who we're supposed to be in love with doesn't really know who we are. So you want to ask questions, and then part 2 of that, third bonus, our bonus today, key, is to listen. Listen. Use these muscles. 4th key, which would have been the 3rd, but since we did a bonus, this is going to be the 4th key to making your relationship last, is prioritize the relationship. Prioritize the relationship. Now, this may seem like a no-brainer, but again, in our busy go world, we do not do this enough. We will often give everything a priority over our relationships, and we'll put relationships as last because, again, we go back to assuming that because they're married to us, because they're in a relationship with us, they have to love us no matter what, and they're going to understand. Right? Show of hands. Anybody ever done that before? Anybody ever prioritized everything else other than your partner because I appreciate that Julia just said guilty, because you assume that they're going to understand, right? They have to love you. They're in a relationship with you. They have to like you. They have to understand. Part of being in a relationship with you, right? How many of us have said this? Well, you're in a relationship with me, and part of being in a relationship with me is to understand that this has to be priority number one. I've definitely done that before. And there's a time and place for everything, right? This doesn't mean to say that every time your partner or your significant other wants some attention, you're stopping everything to give it to them. But what this does mean is it means you're carving out time in your day to make sure you're connecting with them, to make sure the relationship's being a priority, to let them know that they're loved, that they're cared for. And then we're not talking about life-altering time here. These can be a couple text messages throughout the day. It could be setting aside a few minutes at the end of the day to ask questions. It could be just planning a day or a few hours once a week to go on a date together, to hang out together, to watch a movie together, to go grab a beer or a cocktail together, to do something that the other one enjoys, right? You're putting it in your schedule every week that there's something there that is focused on the other person and your relationship as a whole. Because again, if we don't prioritize our relationships, what we'll do is we'll put them at the very bottom because we'll assume that they're always going to be okay because they have to be okay. Nothing can be further from the truth. These are the things that need to be, these are the people who are likely the closest to and the most important and significant in our lives. And we should treat them as such and give them the priority that they deserve. Give them the priority they deserve. Because if you're not going to do it, nobody else is going to do it for you. And then what happens? Most of us may have experienced this before, is one day we wake up and we realize that we haven't been prioritizing a relationship. Our partners feel like they haven't been heard. We haven't been asking questions. We've just fallen into the routine and we've done nothing new for a while. And now we look at the person who's in that, we're sharing four walls with them, we don't even recognize who they are. And then the relationship falls apart. Or if it doesn't, if the relationship is lucky enough to have two people in it who are dedicated to trying to work on it, that can be done too, but it takes some work, and it's a lot bigger uphill battle than it is if you're doing these things often and always. I've had the privilege of working with quite a few people, both in relationships, individuals in relationships, and couples in relationships. And I've seen it go every which way possible. I've seen people who are completely at ends, not getting along at all, total, always conflict, yelling, screaming, fighting, and they go on to have the most amazing and fulfilling relationships out of anybody, right? People are jealous of them. I've seen people who are, they end up deciding that they want to separate, but they're able to separate amicably. I've seen people who are in okay relationships have phenomenal relationships because they're able to date. I've seen people who are in okay relationships who, they do a little work, but they decide that in the process that this isn't the person for the second half of their life. See, relationships are really fascinating because it's always going to come down to two people in the relationship and where they're all at that time in life. We have a choice of either growing together or we can grow apart. What I've shared with you today are some key strategies, key ideas that will help you grow together. You don't do these things, you very much likely will end up growing apart. And where you go from there, I can't tell you. That's up for you to decide. And if you find yourself in that place, two things I encourage you to do. Number one is start doing these things right away. Number two, if you need some help, reach out to me. Send me an email, and then we can talk about what it's going to look like, and we can put you in a coaching program that will be designed to help improve your relationship and turn it around. And we can do it a one-on-one one, or we can do it as a couples too, which is always fun. And bring your poor connection. Okay, my iPad just shut off for a second. That's what I have for today. So just a quick recap, and then we'll answer questions. 4 keys. I know we said 3, but we did a bonus one. 4 keys to making your relationship last. Number 1, keeping it new. Bringing some newness into it. Relationships can get stagnant. A stagnant relationship is going to sink. A new relationship will float and soar. So bringing new things, making it your mission to incorporate newness into the relationship. Number 2, asking questions. Asking questions. Don't assume your way through the relationship. Ask questions. Get to know your partner. I don't care how long you've been together. You do not know everything there is to know about them, so ask some questions. And even if you think you know what they're going to say, ask the question a different way to see if they say it differently so you can learn something new. Number 3 is after you ask questions, use these muscles. Make sure you listen. Do not just go blah, 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 and then wait to be right or make them wrong, which is what tragically so many of us do. Asking questions is not about validation. Asking questions and doing it from a loving, non-judgmental place is the key to relationship growth. So when you ask questions, use these muscles right afterwards, and that's key 3 is listening. Key number 4 is prioritize the relationship. This is a person that's arguably the most important person in your life. If that's really the case, make them that. Make them that. Make them the most important person. Make time for the relationship. Prioritize it each and every day. And by doing so, you'll find that you'll have a lot of space for the relationship to grow and flourish for years to come. All right. Thank you so much, everybody, for listening. What questions do you have about this? I have some time to answer questions. So what questions do you have? Has this been helpful? Has this been of value to you all? Did you learn something? Are you going to implement in your relationship?